Maria, thank you for opening up with your important and compelling witness testimony, particularly with respect to the rendering of the heroism of your father. I'm delighted that our Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights was able to be part of those keyboard warriors, and I want to single out Brandon Silver, who's our Director of Projects and who handled being the keyboard warrior for our organization. And as you put it, it all demonstrated the power of solidarity in a just cause and the importance, therefore, of our working together in common cause. And so I'm delighted to be part of this panel, which includes Antonio Ledesma, a democratically elected mayor of Caracas, who was brutally imprisoned, who managed to escape, who is the heroic father of a heroic family. And we had the pleasure of hearing your daughter here, and we see, therefore, the passage of the torch from generation to generation in that moral leadership. And Luis Almagro, the courageous Secretary General of the Organization of American States, as Hillel Neuer referred to him this morning, a moral beacon in our world, speaking up for the Venezuelan people, unmasking and exposing the cultures of criminality and corruption and the impunity that underpins it in Venezuela. A Venezuela that sits now on the United Nations Council of Human Rights, whose mandate, the mandate of this council, is the promotion and protection of human rights, whose obligation, the members of the council, is the full implementation of these rights and freedoms. And where, as the resolution establishing the UN Council on Human Rights put it, and I quote, members elected to the council shall uphold the highest standards in the promotion and protection of human rights. At its founding, as Hillel Neuer spoke so eloquently of it this morning, the UN Human Rights Council, then the Human Rights Commission, was inspired by legendary heroes as Eleanor Roosevelt, René Cassin, John Humphrey, who was my teacher actually at McGill University and one of the draftspeople of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But today, the Council includes Maduro's Venezuela. And I use the term, Maduro's Venezuela, to distinguish it from the people and publics in Venezuela who are otherwise the targets of mass domestic repression. So when I speak of Venezuela, Maduro's Venezuela, I am speaking of the regime engaged in these violations, not of the people that are the targets of those violations. A regime which, as the Foreign Minister of Canada, Chrystia Freeland, put it so eloquently months ago, has been sliding into dictatorship. A regime which is in standing violation of its obligations as a member of the UN Human Rights Council, where the special prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, Ms. Bensouda, with whom I met several days ago, where the special prosecutor has now opened a preliminary examination into the situation in Venezuela, where the United Nations Commission on Human Rights and the Commissioner on Human Rights has itself released a report with respect to the widespread and systematic violations of human rights in Venezuela. And I met this morning with the UN Commissioner on Human Rights, a great UN Commissioner on Human Rights, who are again engaged in producing yet another report with respect to Venezuela to unmask and hold to account those who engage in these violations. And where I've been delighted, as Marie mentioned, to be a member of an international panel of, as we've been somewhat pretentiously called, legal experts appointed by the Organization of American States to look into the situation in Venezuela and to determine whether crimes against humanity are in fact being committed, and if so, to refer the matter to the OAS and to the International Criminal Court as to whether there are reasonable grounds to believe that such crimes of humanity as set forth in the Rome Treaty are being committed. And where we have had compelling witness testimony and documentary evidence, and we've had a series of hearings at the OAS in Washington, where we heard from formerly exiled mayors and legislators, victims of human rights violations, human rights heroes, and the like, heard compelling witness testimony, as we also reviewed documentary evidence of extrajudicial executions, of widespread and systematic attacks on the civilian population as a matter of state policy, of widespread and systematic acts of torture, persecution, imprisonment, rape, forced disappearances, and the like, all of which are designated as crimes against humanity under the Treaty for an International Criminal Court, and indeed the whole constitutive of crimes against humanity, at a time where we are commemorating, as we did in The Hague a few days ago, and I was present at that, the 20th anniversary of the establishment of this International Criminal Court, the institutionalization of the Nuremberg legacy, of the combating of impunity, of the responsibility to bring these hostis humanus generis, these enemies of humankind, to justice. And perhaps the most disturbing witness testimony and documentary evidence that we reviewed was the intensification and escalation of human suffering of the people of Venezuela. I'm speaking about dramatic increases in infant mortality, dramatic increases in maternal mortality. I'm speaking of the absence of food, the absence of medicine, the dramatic increase, in fact, in diseases that had not been existing before, whether we are talking about tuberculosis or diphtheria or cholera and the like. The whole resulting from a state policy of deliberate denial of any possibility for humanitarian assistance to the suffering Venezuelan people. Inhumane acts that are constitutive also under the Treaty for an International Criminal Court, constitutive of crimes against humanity. And where we are witness in this context of systematic and widespread violations of human rights, we are witnessing, as the Secretary General put it this morning, the dismantling of democracy, the assault on the rule of law, the assault on an independent judiciary, the corruption of the instruments of justice. In a word, what we are witnessing is the denouement of democracy and the protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms in Venezuela. And let me close, if I may, with a case study, because it is the 4th anniversary of the initial arrest and subsequent imprisonment of one of the leaders, the Democratic opposition, Leopoldo Lopez. But what was so revealing in the witness testimony that we heard was the following. The prosecutor in the case, Franklin Neves, who escaped from Venezuela, spoke of the prosecution as having been based on trumped-up charges, that Leopoldo Lopez was innocent of all the charges against him, that the trial was a sham trial, that there was no justice in his arrest. And we heard from the judge in the case, Renata Tovar, who's now seeking refugee status in Canada, now in Toronto. She spoke of having been ordered to issue an arrest warrant in the case of Leopoldo Lopez. So we have the active complicity as an instrument of state policy of the highest leadership in Venezuela in the prosecution and imprisonment of Leopoldo Lopez. And finally, on this point, witness testimony. Witnesses who spoke of them being brutally tortured in order to provide false testimony against Leopoldo Lopez. And so, at this point, what is so necessary now is for the international community to stand up for democracy, to stand up for human rights and fundamental freedoms, to stand up for the people of Venezuela as we hold the criminal regime in Venezuela accountable for its widespread and systematic violations of human rights as part of the overriding assault on the rule of law, democracy, human rights, and freedom in Venezuela. Thank you.